This is the Injury Report, presented by NYU Langone Health. Yankee fans were glad to get one of their key pieces back as Anthony Rizzo came off the injured list earlier this week. But how will Rizzo fare now that he's back in the lineup? Let's talk about it on the latest edition of the Injury Report with Dr. Borowski of NYU Langone Sports Medicine Center. Doctor, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Glad to have you here. So let's talk about it with Anthony Rizzo, because in a game against the Red Sox back in mid-June, Rizzo suffered a fracture to the radial neck of his right arm. What's the typical timeline for someone to return after that injury?
So usually it's about 6 to 8 weeks. So he's really on track for recovery in our kind of expected timeline.
So that's it. This is short, 6 to 8 weeks. He can get back. He's on track.
As long as, all other, health conditions and metabolic conditions are set and good for him, he should be, good to go with 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes it can take longer. We do quote sometimes more like 12 weeks, but 6 to 8 is a very typical timeline.
Gotcha with that there. So he didn't have to have surgery. What does that tell you about his injury? And is there any instance in which a fractured forearm would require surgery?
There's a couple of things that we take into consideration when thinking about surgical versus non-surgical treatment. Most likely what he had was something called a non-displaced fracture, meaning that the ends of the fracture pieces were pretty close to each other or minimally displaced. And if they are further apart, more displaced, or they are angulated to a certain degree, or if the other bone in the forearm is also affected, if the ulna is also fractured, those are some considerations for when we would go to surgery rather than a non-operative treatment. But the fact that they were able to treat it non-operatively usually means that it was non-displaced or minimally displaced.
Gotcha, and that is good news for Yankee fans. So Rizzo now is back on the recovery process in terms of the lineup. He's playing in the minor leagues, but he spent about 2 months recovering. He just started a rehab assignment. So what factors are team doctors considering when it comes to deciding when he's ready to actually return to the lineup with the big league club?
One of the things that we look at when we're returning anyone with a fracture back to more higher impact play or higher intensity play is whether or not there's been a bony callus that is formed around the fracture edges. So when we fracture a bone, the body lays down more bone around that fracture site, and then it remodels it over time to make it look like it had previously. So we want to look for that bony callus so that we know that that fracture is nice and connected again. We see that on x-ray. So that's why we continuously take serial x-rays every couple of weeks to see whether or not that bony callus has formed. And then we start to add in a little bit more intensity to the workouts that he's doing. Can he tolerate more weight bearing without significant pain? And then we start the rehab process like he's starting to now. We want to make sure that we're gradually adding back in intensity and weight training and high impact like he would experience when he's hitting a baseball off of a bat.
And that's the process of where he is right now. And so we saw him advance to playing first base a bit earlier than expected. He played first base on Tuesday night when he was expected to potentially mix in action this weekend. So he's a bit ahead of schedule. Does that seem like a sign that his return to the big league lineup could be even closer?
I think it's a really good sign. I think he's got a really great team behind him medically, and I don't think they would advance him faster than what he should be. So I think it's a good sign that hopefully his return is in the very near future.
All right, that's what Yankee fans definitely want to hear, that he can return to the big league club pretty soon. But then here's the other question, Doctor. Will he have any limitations once he does return? Because as you said, always monitoring, always want to be cautious. So will Rizzo have any limitations once he does get back to the big club?
Probably not. So I don't say the nice thing about a fracture, but when you have a radial neck fracture, it doesn't usually involve the joint itself. So we worry about fractures that get into the joint because it can increase your risk of things like early arthritis into that joint or pain because of the joint movement. And so when it's outside of the fracture, outside of the joint, it tends to have less joint issues going forward. So once that bone is healed, hopefully he should be just fine.
All right, sounds like good news for the Yankee fans who should be excited that Anthony Rizzo is back in the lineup in the minor leagues for now. Hopefully can get to the big club pretty soon. That is Dr. Borowski of NYU Langone Sports Medicine Center. Doctor, pleasure to talk to you on this edition of the Injury Report. We'll catch up soon.
Thank you so much for having me.